Picture a winter night in the Carpathian Mountains at the dawn of the 17th century. The wind howls through the jagged rocks, carrying with it the cries of wolves hunting in the distance. Through the dense fog, a dark silhouette rises above the hills, Countess castle. Torches flicker faintly along its towers, like watchful eyes staring down at anyone who dares to wander too close. For the villagers below, this fortress was not just a seat of noble power. It was the very heart of unspeakable fear. A place whispered about in every tavern, around every fire, and behind every locked door. They gave her many names. Some called her the Mistress of Blood, others, the She-Devil of Transylvania. But history remembers her as Elizabeth Bathory. She was a woman of breathtaking beauty and extraordinary power, a noblewoman whose face seemed untouched by time. In an age where sickness, war, and famine etched deep lines into every countenance, Elizabeth's eternal youth was not just suspicious, it was terrifying. And so, from hushed lips, a legend began to spread. Her secret to everlasting beauty was not a potion, nor a prayer, but blood. The stories grew darker with each retelling. Young servant girls entered the castle gates and never returned. Poor families who entrusted their daughters to Elizabeth's service heard nothing back but silence. And on rare occasions, those who stumbled out alive bore scars carved into their flesh and eyes that never lost their horror. They were drained, the whispers claimed. Hung, cut, and bled, so the Countess could bathe in their blood. Yet here lies the strangest part. For years, both the crown and the church remained silent. In an era where accusations of witchcraft or heresy could bring swift, merciless trials, why was Elizabeth Bathory spared? Was it her immense fortune, her noble bloodline, or her deep ties to the ruling powers that shielded her? Or was it simply that the story itself, the myth of a blood-drinking countess, served a purpose far larger than one woman's cruelty? Elizabeth Bathory's tale exists in the uneasy space between legend and history. Was she truly the most prolific female serial killer the world has ever known? Or was she the victim of a political conspiracy designed to strip her of wealth and erase her from power? 4 centuries later, her name still chills the air. Her shadow lingers not just in historical records, but in Gothic novels, vampire lore, and whispered campfire tales. As we peel back the layers of myth, we find ourselves confronted with a disturbing truth. Sometimes, history itself is more frightening than the darkest of legends. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary, the Bathorys. Their bloodline was ancient, their influence enormous. Generals, cardinals, and even princes of Transylvania came from this family. Elizabeth's birthright guaranteed her wealth, land, and power. But she was more than just privileged, she was brilliant. Unlike many women of her time, Elizabeth was highly educated. She spoke several languages, read Latin fluently, and was trained in the complexities of estate management and politics. She grew up not as a passive noblewoman, but as someone prepared to wield authority. Accounts describe her as strikingly beautiful, tall, pale, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. But behind her composed appearance, Elizabeth possessed a sharp, calculating mind. She understood that in the game of nobility, beauty faded, but intelligence and power could endure. At the age of 15, Elizabeth was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a young nobleman from another influential Hungarian family. The marriage was as much a political alliance as it was a personal union, cementing the power of 2 dynasties. The wedding was grand, attended by nobles, warriors, and clergy, a spectacle meant to announce the union of wealth and military strength. Elizabeth brought with her a massive dowry, including the ominous Countess castle, a fortress that would later become infamous as the stage for the rumors of her crimes. Ferenc was often away, serving as a commander in wars against the Ottoman Empire. His reputation as a fearless warrior earned him the nickname, the Black Knight of Hungary. While he fought on distant battlefields, Elizabeth assumed control of their estates, commanding servants, managing finances, and even settling disputes. It was a role rarely granted to women at the time, but Elizabeth embraced it with cold efficiency. It was during these years that the seeds of her dark reputation may have been sown. Some villagers whispered that Elizabeth, left alone with unchecked power, began experimenting with harsh punishments for her servants. Rumors circulated of her temper, her cruelty toward disobedience, and her fascination with suffering. But others argue that these whispers were nothing more than political gossip, jealous inventions of rivals who could not accept the sight of a woman running vast lands with authority greater than many men. What is certain is that Elizabeth Bathory commanded absolute control. She oversaw hundreds of servants and peasants across her estates. She could summon young peasant girls into her service at will, a practice not uncommon among nobles. For many poor families, sending a daughter to work in a noble household promised food, shelter, and perhaps the chance of a better life. But as years went by, more and more of those daughters disappeared behind the castle walls. At first, no one dared to question it. In a world where peasants' lives were seen as disposable, the loss of a few servants raised no alarms. But as the disappearances mounted, unease began to ripple through the villages. Parents whispered their fears, priests muttered dark suspicions, and yet, still, no authority moved against Elizabeth. Her position shielded her from scrutiny. She was untouchable. By the time her husband Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth Bathory was no longer just a noblewoman. She was a widow in her mid-40s, commanding enormous estates, vast wealth, and a private fortress of her own. To her allies, she was a formidable leader. To her enemies, she was a dangerous obstacle. To the peasants, she was already a figure of terror. And so, with her husband gone and her independence at its peak, the stage was set for the darkest chapter of her life, the chapter that would forever brand her as the Blood Countess. The story of Elizabeth Bathory took its most horrifying turn after the death of her husband. No longer under the shadow of the Black Knight, Elizabeth ruled her estates alone. It was during these years that whispers grew louder, transforming from vague rumors of cruelty into grotesque tales of blood and torture. The most famous legend begins with a single, almost trivial moment. One evening, a servant girl was brushing Elizabeth's long dark hair. Nervous and clumsy, the girl tugged too hard, pulling a strand. In a fit of rage, Elizabeth struck her across the face. Blood spattered onto the Countess's hand. When she wiped it away, the story goes, she believed the skin beneath looked smoother, younger, more radiant. It was as if a secret had been revealed to her, that the key to eternal beauty was not magic, nor prayer, but blood. From that moment, the legend claims, Elizabeth became obsessed. She sought out the blood of young maidens, convinced that bathing in it, even drinking it, could preserve her youth. The tales grew darker with every retelling. Some said she had special rooms built within Chakti's castle, chambers lined with hooks and drains, designed to bleed her victims clean. Others spoke of wooden racks, cages, and iron instruments used to pierce and tear the flesh of her servants. Elizabeth, they whispered, would watch with cold fascination, sometimes even participating in the torture herself. When the girls were dead, their blood was collected into basins. The Countess would then step into the crimson pool, immersing herself in what she believed was the fountain of youth. Numbers began to circulate. First dozens, then hundreds. One witness later claimed there were as many as 650 victims, though this figure likely came from testimony extracted under torture. Still, the number stuck, sealing Elizabeth Bathory's place as one of history's most prolific killers. The victims, according to the stories, were mostly peasant girls lured to the castle with promises of work. Their families, poor and desperate, sent them willingly, never to see them again. But as Elizabeth's appetite grew bolder, some versions of the legend say she even began targeting daughters of lesser nobility, girls of higher birth who could not disappear unnoticed. That, historians suggest, may have been her downfall. To the peasants, she became a figure of pure terror. Mothers warned their daughters never to walk near the castle alone. Priests whispered of unholy practices, comparing her to a vampire, a demon in human form. And yet, for years, the authorities did nothing. How could they? Elizabeth Bathory was no common criminal. She was a noblewoman with vast lands, immense wealth, and ties to the throne. To accuse her openly was to accuse power itself. Still, the rumors would not die. Travelers passing through spoke of screams carried on the night wind. Merchants swore they saw pale corpses being carted away under cover of darkness. Servants who escaped told of unimaginable horrors. Girls beaten until their bones snapped, flesh torn with needles, bodies left to freeze outside in the snow, then dragged back inside once lifeless. But here lies the enduring mystery. Were these stories real, or were they inventions designed to destroy her? Historians now argue that much of the so-called evidence came from witnesses who were tortured into confessing. The more gruesome the tale, the more satisfying it was to Elizabeth's political enemies, and she had many enemies. As a wealthy widow with no husband to control her, Elizabeth stood as an anomaly in a patriarchal society. She owned vast lands, commanded troops, and held influence that rivaled powerful men. To ambitious nobles, she was both a threat and a prize. By turning her into a monster, they could strip her of power and seize her fortune. Yet the legend persisted because it was irresistible. The image of a beautiful woman, bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, captured the imagination like no simple accusation ever could. It blurred the line between human cruelty and supernatural evil, a tale too horrific not to be repeated. And so, Elizabeth Bathory's name began its transformation from noblewoman to myth. She was no longer merely a Countess of Hungary. She became the Blood Countess, a living nightmare who fed on innocence. Whether fact or fiction, the legend had taken root. It was only a matter of time before even kings and priests could no longer ignore it. By the year 1610, the whispers surrounding Elizabeth Bathory had grown too loud to be ignored. Villagers were terrified, priests murmured against her in hushed tones, and even fellow nobles began to look at her with suspicion. The disappearance of servant girls could be overlooked for years, but when the daughters of minor nobility were said to be among her victims, the matter could no longer remain buried. The king himself, Matthias II of Hungary, was pressured to act. On a cold December night, Count György Thurzo, a powerful noble and relative by marriage, led a troop of soldiers to Countess castle. They stormed the gates, expecting to confront the unimaginable. What they claimed to find became the stuff of nightmares. Girls dead, others wounded and chained, their bodies marked by torture. Elizabeth Bathory herself was allegedly caught in the act. At least that is what the official story says. But like everything about the Countess, the truth is tangled in shadows. What is certain is that Elizabeth Bathory was arrested and placed under house arrest in her own castle. But unlike others accused of witchcraft or murder at the time, she was never brought before a public court. No execution, no pyre, no trial in the town square. Instead, her case was handled quietly, behind closed doors. Why? The answer may lie not in the crime she was accused of, but in the power she represented. The testimonies against her were chilling. Servants describing cruel punishments, brutal tortures, and rivers of blood. Yet nearly all of these accounts were gathered under torture themselves. People will confess to anything when their lives are on the line, and in Elizabeth's case, the more horrific the story, the more convincing the case against her appeared. It was said that her accomplices confessed to helping kill hundreds of girls, but they too suffered grisly executions while Elizabeth remained alive, hidden away. Historians argue that the trial was less about justice and more about politics. Elizabeth Bathory was a wealthy widow who controlled vast estates and castles. Her holdings were worth a fortune, and if she were convicted, those lands could be seized. King Matthias II, deeply in debt, stood to benefit greatly if the Bathory fortune was stripped away. Thurzo, the man who led the investigation, was also in line to gain politically by eliminating a rival of immense influence. And then there is the matter of her gender. A woman of such wealth and power, ruling without a husband, was already seen as unnatural in the patriarchal society of 17th century Hungary. Men could go to war, rule estates, and govern without question. But a woman, she was expected to remain a wife, a mother, a figure of support, never a ruler in her own right. To many, Elizabeth's independence was reason enough to view her as dangerous. Turning her into a monster justified stripping her of authority. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory was never put to death. Instead, she was confined to her castle, sealed inside rooms whose windows were bricked up, leaving only small slits for food and air. Her accomplices were executed brutally, burned alive or beheaded, while the Countess of Countess was left to waste away in solitude. She would spend the last 4 years of her life in this silent prison, fading into myth even as she still breathed. In August of 1614, a guard found her dead, lying face down on the floor. She was 54 years old. The world outside had already moved on, repeating the stories of her cruelty, cementing her image as the Blood Countess. But the quiet, secretive way her case was handled leaves behind a troubling question. Was justice served, or was Elizabeth Bathory silenced not for crimes, but for power? Elizabeth Bathory died in August of 1614, sealed inside her own fortress. Her death was quiet, almost anticlimactic compared to the horrifying legends that surrounded her life. She was buried quickly, but not in Countess, where villagers refused to allow her body to rest. Even in death, she was unwelcome. To this day, the exact location of her grave remains unknown, her body erased, as if history itself wanted to forget her. But history did not forget. Instead, it twisted her name into something larger than life. Elizabeth Bathory became immortal, not through youth or beauty, but through legend. The whispers of her supposed bloodbath spread far beyond Hungary, finding their way into European folklore. The image of a noblewoman draining virgins of their blood to preserve her beauty became irresistible, a perfect tale of vanity, cruelty, and horror. In the centuries that followed, Elizabeth's story transformed into Gothic myth. Writers of the 18th and 19th centuries folded her into the growing fascination with the supernatural. Some say her legend directly influenced vampire lore, especially the character of Countess Dracula. Long before Bram Stoker's Dracula gave us the image of the immortal vampire, Elizabeth Bathory had already been painted as a figure who fed on innocence to defy time. But was she truly guilty? Modern historians are divided. Some insist that she must have committed terrible crimes. Too many witnesses, too many missing girls, too many stories to dismiss entirely. Others argue that she was the victim of a political conspiracy, a powerful widow crushed under the weight of greed and patriarchy. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, that she was cruel and abusive, but that her crimes were exaggerated into monstrous proportions to serve the ambitions of others. What is certain is that her name has outlived the men who sought to destroy her. The kings, the judges, the nobles who plotted her downfall, they are footnotes in history. Elizabeth Bathory, however, remains a symbol. To some, she is the ultimate female predator, bathing in blood to feed her vanity. To others, she is a warning of how fear, rumor, and politics can combine to create a legend more powerful than truth. More than 400 years later, the shadow of the Blood Countess still lingers. She lives in novels, in films, in ghost stories told by candlelight. She is whispered about in the same breath as vampires, witches, and monsters. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. In the end, Elizabeth Bathory did achieve immortality, not through the blood of her victims, but through the stories we still tell about her. So ask yourself, was Elizabeth Bathory truly the most prolific female serial killer in history? Or was she a woman destroyed by envy, fear, and ambition, her life rewritten into a nightmare the world could never resist repeating? Perhaps we will never know. But in the silence of her ruined castle, in the echo of the Carpathian winds, the whispers remain.